There is a moment quiet, unannounced, almost invisible when power shifts, not because someone raised their voice, not because they demanded more, but because they finally stopped abandoning themselves. And if you've ever wondered why an avoidant suddenly seems unsettled, defensive, or strangely triggered by your calm, it's because something profound is happening beneath the surface. A super empath doesn't destroy an ego by attacking it. That would be too obvious, too loud, too easy. What actually dismantles an avoidance ego is the absence of need. The moment you stop chasing clarity, reassurance, or emotional availability, you remove the stage they were performing on. And when someone's sense of control depends on distance, your grounded stillness becomes terrifying. See, avoidants are often comfortable when they feel needed, but not required to fully show up. They like the upper hand that emotional distance gives them. But a super empath who has done the inner work doesn't beg for presence, they choose alignment. And that choice silently says, I know my worth, with or without you. That sentence is never spoken, yet it lands harder than any confrontation ever could. Your emotional intelligence becomes a mirror, not a weapon, just a reflection. You listen without absorbing. You care without overextending. You love without self-betrayal. And suddenly, the avoidant is faced with something they can't dismiss: your peace. Peace is confronting to someone who survives by staying emotionally disconnected. It exposes the truth. They've been running from that intimacy isn't. Dangerous avoidance is when you set boundaries without anger, when you walk away without resentment, when you stop explaining yourself to be understood. Their ego feels something unfamiliar, not rejection, but irrelevance. And to an ego built on control, irrelevance feels like annihilation. There's a divine principle at play here. What is not aligned cannot remain comfortable in the presence of truth. Your growth doesn't punish them, it reveals them. Your healing doesn't shame them, it reminds them of the work they haven't done. And the most unsettling part, you didn't do anything to them. You simply chose yourself. A super empath who is healed becomes unpredictable, not because they're inconsistent, but because they're no longer reactive. You don't chase when someone pulls away. You don't collapse when affection is withheld. You don't negotiate your worth. And that lack of emotional leverage destabilizes the dynamic completely. The avoidance ego wants to believe they were the prize. Your peace proves the connection was mutual and survivable without them. That realization hits deep because now they're left alone with the one thing they avoided all along: themselves. So if you notice someone pulling back harder, minimizing your value, or suddenly acting indifferent to your growth, understand this. You didn't lose them. You outgrew the version of yourself that needed them to feel whole. And that quiet evolution is the most powerful statement you will ever make. You don't need to win. You don't need closure. You don't need to be chosen by someone who can't choose themselves. Your calm, your boundaries, your self-respect, those are not just acts of self-love. They are signals to the universe that you are no longer available for half-hearted connections. And the truth is, when you stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you, the only ego that falls apart is the one that depended on your self-doubt to survive. A super empath reaches a point where they no longer seek validation from someone who withholds emotional presence. And this shift is far more powerful than any demand or ultimatum. At first, they may have tried to explain their feelings, hoping to be seen, heard, or chosen more fully. But growth teaches them something essential. Validation that has to be chased is not validation at all. When they stop looking outside themselves for reassurance, the dynamic changes instantly. The avoidant, who was once comfortable offering affection on their own terms, suddenly feels the absence of something they assumed would always be there: the empath's emotional investment. This withdrawal isn't cold or calculated. It's quiet, grounded, and deeply self-respecting. The super empath doesn't disappear to punish. They simply redirect their energy back to themselves. And that is precisely what unsettles the avoidant. Validation was the unspoken currency of the relationship. Knowing they were wanted, needed, or emotionally prioritized gave them a sense of importance without requiring full vulnerability. When that currency is removed, the ego begins to panic. Silence, when it comes from emotional maturity, is not empty. It is full of meaning. The super empath's silence says, I trust myself now. It says, I no longer need you to tell me who I am. For someone whose sense of control depended on being the emotional gatekeeper, This silence feels destabilizing. The avoidant may interpret it as disinterest, arrogance, or emotional distance, but underneath those interpretations lies fear. Fear of no longer being central, fear of being optional, fear of losing relevance. What makes this especially confronting is that the empath isn't angry. They're not dramatic. They're not trying to provoke a reaction. They are simply no longer available for emotional breadcrumbs. This creates a vacuum the avoidant doesn't know how to fill. Without the empath seeking reassurance, the avoidant is left alone with their own doubts. Questions arise that were once drowned out by the empath's emotional libido. Am I enough? Do I actually bring value? What happens if I'm not needed? The ego thrives on external reinforcement. When someone consistently looks to you for approval or emotional anchoring, it can create a subtle sense of superiority. The moment that stops, the ego interprets it as loss of power. The avoidant may respond by pulling further away, acting indifferent, or attempting to reassert control through distance. But these behaviors are not signs of strength. They are signs of discomfort. The silence has done what confrontation never could. It has exposed the imbalance. For the super empath, this shift is liberating. They no longer feel compelled to prove their worth or explain their depth. They understand that being emotionally rich does not mean being endlessly available. Their self-validation becomes an anchor, grounding them in a sense of wholeness. That does not fluctuate based on someone else's availability. And paradoxically, this wholeness is what makes the avoidant feel smaller. The avoidant's ego is not destroyed in a dramatic collapse. It erodes quietly, as they realize they are no longer the emotional authority. The empath's silence removes the mirror they relied on to feel significant. Without someone reflecting their importance back to them, they are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Connection requires reciprocity, not control. This is why the absence of validation is so powerful. It doesn't accuse, it doesn't beg, it doesn't explain. It simply exists as a boundary. And boundaries, when held with calm certainty, challenge egos that were built on emotional asymmetry. The super empath doesn't announce their growth, they live it. And in doing so, they reveal just how fragile an ego can be when it was never rooted in true emotional security to begin with. A super empath carries an emotional depth that is not loud, performative, or demanding, yet it has an undeniable weight. This depth isn't something they wield intentionally, it's simply who they are. They notice subtleties, understand unspoken feelings, and connect meaning to moments others might overlook. In the presence of an avoidant, this depth quietly illuminates the contrast between emotional availability and emotional avoidance. Without pointing fingers or naming flaws, the empath's way of being reveals what is missing, and that exposure can feel deeply threatening. The avoidant often prides themselves on independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional restraint. These traits can look like strength on the surface, but when placed beside genuine emotional fluency, their limitations become visible. The super empath doesn't demand vulnerability. They naturally invite it. Their presence creates a space where emotions are safe, understood, and accepted. For someone who has learned to survive by minimizing feelings, that space can feel overwhelming. It highlights the emotional range they haven't learned to access. And the ego responds defensively. What makes this dynamic I see particularly uncomfortable is that the empath isn't trying to outshine or expose anyone. They aren't saying you lack depth. They simply show up as themselves, curious, compassionate, emotionally attuned. In doing so, they unknowingly set a standard. The avoidant may sense that they are seen more clearly than they are comfortable with. Being truly seen requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens an ego that equates control with safety. This exposure often triggers subtle reactions. The avoidant may intellectualize emotions, change the subject where conversations deepen, or dismiss emotional nuance as unnecessary. These behaviors aren't random, they are protective mechanisms. Emotional depth challenges the story the avoidant tells themselves about who they are. If they believe they are just not emotional or fine on their own, the empath's depth quietly contradicts that narrative by demonstrating how much richer connection can be. The super empath's emotional intelligence also brings a form of accountability. They can sense inconsistencies between words and actions, intentions and behaviors. They may not call it out directly, but their awareness changes how they respond. They don't overextend to compensate for distance. They don't chase clarity when energy feels off. This attunement forces the avoidance ego to confront something uncomfortable. Emotional detachment doesn't go unnoticed. It doesn't grant immunity from consequence. It simply changes the consequence. CS. For the avoidant, this can feel like a loss of control. They are no longer able to hide behind ambiguity or mixed signals. The empath's clarity makes the avoidant's emotional shortcuts visible. And visibility is destabilizing to an ego that prefers to operate in the shadows of vagueness. The empath's depth doesn't accuse, but it does reflect. It reflects the gap between connection desired and connection offered. Over time, the avoidant may feel smaller in the presence of this depth, not because the empath diminishes them, but because emotional capacity cannot be faked indefinitely. The empath's ability to hold space, feel deeply, and remain grounded exposes the cost of emotional avoidance. It brings to the surface the loneliness, the fear of dependence, and the unresolved wounds that avoidance was meant to protect. For the super empath, this process is often unconscious. They are not trying to challenge an ego or prove superiority. They are simply aligned with their inner world, yet alignment has power. It reveals truths without confrontation and invites growth without force. The avoidance ego reacts not to attack, but to comparison between what is possible and what is currently available. In this way, emotional depth becomes transformative. It doesn't shame or coerce. It gently but persistently shines a light on emotional limitations that can no longer be ignored. And when an ego has been built on the belief that distance equals strength, that light can feel blinding. Calm self-respect is one of the most misunderstood forms of power, especially in dynamics where distance and emotional withdrawal have been used as leverage. A super empath who embodies self-respect does not announce it, demand recognition for it, or use it as a tool to control others. It shows up in how they speak, what they tolerate, and most importantly, what they no longer tolerate. For an avoidant whose ego has learned to equate control with safety, this quiet confidence can feel deeply threatening. Avoidant egos often rely on predictability. They feel secure when they know someone will remain emotionally available regardless of how little they offer in return. In these dynamics, emotional inconsistency becomes a form of control. When the super empath begins to operate from calm self-respect, that predictability disappears. They no longer over-explain, over-accommodate, or soften their needs to keep the connection intact. They remain kind, but they are no longer flexible at the cost of their own dignity. This shift unsettles the avoidant because calm self-respect cannot be provoked. It does not argue, it does not chase, it does not escalate when faced with emotional distance. Instead, it responds with clarity and choice. The empath may simply say less, engage less, or step back without drama. To an ego that expects emotional reactions as proof of importance, this restraint feels like rejection. Even though no rejection was ever intended, there is something confronting about someone who knows their value and does not need to convince you of it. The avoidance ego may interpret this as arrogance or emotional coldness, but the truth is more uncomfortable. The empath is no longer seeking permission to exist fully. Their self-respect means they no longer negotiate basic emotional reciprocity. And when someone refuses to negotiate their worth, it exposes the imbalance that was previously hidden. Calm self-respect also disrupts power dynamics because it removes the emotional volatility that avoidant egos often know how to manage. They may be skilled at withdrawing when things get close and returning when they sense pursuit. But when the empath remains steady regardless of proximity or distance, the usual push-pull loses its effectiveness. The avoidant can no longer control the emotional temperature of the connection, and that loss of influence feels destabilizing. What makes this especially impactful is that the empath's self-respect is not rooted in defensiveness. It is not built on walls or bitterness. It is grounded in self-trust. They trust their perceptions, their feelings, and their right to choose environments where they are valued. This kind of self-trust is unsettling to an ego that depends on ambiguity. The empath's clarity leaves little room for manipulation or misinterpretation. The avoidant may respond with subtle tests, pulling away to see if the empath chases, withholding affirmation to see if insecurity surfaces. But When the empath does not react as expected, the ego feels challenged. Calm self-respect sends a quiet message. I'm here by choice, not by fear of losing you. For an ego accustomed to being the one who is emotionally unreachable, this reversal can feel like a loss of identity. Over time, the avoidant may feel exposed. They are no longer the one setting the emotional terms. The empath's boundaries redefine the relationship without ultimatums. And boundaries, when held without anger, are powerful mirrors. They reflect what someone is willing to offer and what they are not. This reflection can feel threatening to an ego that prefers to avoid self-examination. For the super empath, calm self-respect is not about winning or proving a point. It is about alignment between values, actions, and self-worth. Yet alignment has consequences. It naturally disrupts dynamics built on imbalance. The avoidant's ego is not attacked. It is simply no longer accommodated. And for an ego that relied on accommodation to feel secure, that quiet withdrawal of compliance can feel like its foundation is being gently, but firmly removed. Healing changes a super empath in ways that are subtle, on the surface, but profoundly disruptive to old relational patterns. Before healing, their responses were often predictable. They would lean in when someone pulled away, offer understanding when they were hurt, and seek closeness through patience and empathy. These patterns made them emotionally readable and, in some dynamics, easy to anticipate. Once healing begins, that predictability dissolves, not because the empath becomes cold or inconsistent, but because they stop operating from wounds. And that shift alone can destabilize an avoidant's sense of control. Avoidant dynamics often depend on knowing how someone will react. Distance creates leverage when the other person is wired to pursue connection. But when a super empath heals, their responses are no longer driven by fear of abandonment or the need to fix. They may still care deeply, but they don't automatically move toward emotional gaps. Sometimes they pause. Sometimes they choose themselves. Sometimes they simply observe instead of react. This unpredictability is deeply unsettling to someone who relied on emotional patterns to feel safe. The avoidance ego often believes it understands the rules of the relationship. Pull back, and the other person reaches. Stay ambiguous, and they stay engaged. Healing breaks those rules. The empaths no longer chases clarity or reassurance. They are not triggered by silence in the same way. They don't interpret distance as a personal failure that needs to be corrected. This creates a sense of emotional disorientation for the avoidant. The strategies that once worked no longer produce the same outcomes. What makes this destabilizing is that the empath's healing isn't reactive, it's intentional. Their choices are guided by inner alignment rather than emotional reflex. They may take time before responding. They may ask themselves what feels respectful rather than what feels urgent. This introduces a new dynamic where the avoidant can no longer predict or control the emotional flow. When control has been a core defense, losing it feels like a threat to identity. The unpredictability also exposes a deeper truth. The avoidant was never in control of the connection, only of the distance. When the empath stops equating closeness with worth, distance loses its power. The avoidant may attempt to reassert dominance through further withdrawal or sudden engagement, but the empath's healed state absorbs these shifts without losing balance. This neutrality is confronting. It reveals that the emotional center of gravity has moved. Healing also brings discernment. The empath becomes more selective about where they invest energy. They notice patterns they once excused. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy or distance with depth. This discernment means they don't respond to emotional games, even unconsciously. For the avoidance ego, this can feel like invisibility. The empath is no longer hooked by inconsistency and the absence of reaction dismantled. The old power structure. There is also a spiritual element to this shift. Healing aligns the empath with self-trust and inner authority. They no longer look outside themselves to determine how they should feel or act. This internal anchoring makes them emotionally sovereign, and sovereignty cannot be manipulated. The avoidant may sense that the empath no longer needs the relationship to feel whole, and that realization can strike at the core of the ego, the destabilization. N is not dramatic. There are no ultimatums, no confrontations, no emotional outbursts. Instead, there is a quiet recalibration. The empath becomes less available to patterns that don't honor them. They remain open, but not at their own expense. This creates an emotional environment where old strategies fail and the avoidant is left with a familiar script. Unpredictability born from healing is not chaos, it is freedom. And freedom is unsettling to an ego that found safety in emotional predictability and distance. When the super empath no longer dances to the rhythm of old wounds, the entire dynamic shifts. What once felt controllable becomes uncertain, and that uncertainty quietly erodes the illusion of power the avoidant ego depended on. When a super empath begins to set clear boundaries, something profound shifts in the emotional dynamic. Boundaries are not ultimatums or punishments. They are expressions of self-awareness and self-respect. Yet to an avoidant, especially one whose sense of safety is tied to emotional distance, boundaries can feel indistinguishable from rejection. This is not because the empath is pushing them away, but because boundaries interrupt a familiar pattern where closeness was always on the avoidance terms. Avoidants often experience intimacy as something to be regulated. Too much closeness triggers discomfort, while too little risks abandonment. In this delicate balance, they rely on the other person to remain available without demanding consistency. When the empath establishes boundaries, such as needing clear communication, emotional reciprocity, or respect for time and energy, it disrupts this equilibrium. The avoidant may perceive these needs not as reasonable requests, but as pressure or criticism, which activates defensive responses. What intensifies this reaction is the empath's calm delivery. Boundaries spoken without anger leave little room for the avoidant to rationalize withdrawal. There is no emotional chaos to point to, no volatility to justify distance. Instead, there is clarity, and clarity removes ambiguity, which is often where avoidant egos feel most comfortable. When ambiguity disappears, the avoidant is forced to confront whether they can meet the boundary or not. To the avoidant ego, a boundary can feel like a statement of inadequacy. It suggests that what they are offering is not enough. Even when this is not the empath's intention, the avoidant may internalize it as rejection. This is because their ego equates acceptance with being able to remain emotionally distant without consequence. A boundary challenges that equation by asserting that connection requires mutual participation. The super empath does not set boundaries to control behavior. They set them to protect their emotional well-being. But protection can feel like exclusion to someone who is used to unrestricted access. The avoidant may feel a sudden loss of privilege, the privilege of disengaging without explanation, of returning without accountability. This loss is often experienced as rejection, even though the door to connection remains open if respect is present. Boundaries also introduce responsibility. They invite the avoidant to make a choice, step into greater emotional engagement, or accept the natural distance that comes with not meeting the boundary. This choice can feel overwhelming to an ego that prefers passive control. Avoidants may respond by minimizing the importance of the boundary, delaying responses, or framing the empath as too demanding. These reactions serve to protect the ego from confronting its own limitations. For the empath, holding boundaries can be emotionally challenging, especially if they are deeply compassionate. Yet they understand that love without limits becomes self-erasure. Their boundaries are not walls. They are guidelines for healthy interaction. They continue to show care, but they no longer sacrifice themselves to maintain connection. This self-honoring stance quietly shifts the power dynamic. The avoidant's perception of rejection often stems from an internal conflict. On one hand, they desire connection. On the other, they fear the vulnerability it requires. Boundaries bring this conflict into sharp focus. They make it clear that emotional safety cannot be built on avoidance. This realization can feel threatening to the ego, which has relied on distance as a shield. Over time, the empath's consistent boundaries create a new emotional landscape. The avoidant can no longer rely on the empath to absorb discomfort or smooth over inconsistency. The relationship either evolves toward greater mutuality or naturally loosens. In both cases, the empath remains grounded in self-respect. What feels like rejection to the avoidant is, in truth, an invitation to step forward rather than retreat, to engage rather than evade. But invitations require courage to accept, and when that courage is absent, the ego interprets boundaries as abandonment, even though they were never meant to close the door. only to ensure that whoever walks through it does so with intention and care. Authentic confidence is a quiet force. It does not shout, demand, or flaunt itself. Instead, it manifests in the way someone carries themselves, the choices they make, and the energy they bring into every interaction. For a super empath, authentic confidence is not derived from external validation or the approval of others. It comes from a deep alignment with their own values, emotional intelligence, and understanding of self-worth. This kind of confidence is inherently transformative, not only for the empath, but also for those around them, especially for an avoidant whose ego has been built on emotional control and distance. Avoidants often operate under the assumption that power comes from detachment. Their emotional restraint, unpredictability, and strategic withdrawal are all tools to maintain control within relationships. They rely on others seeking them out, chasing connection, or adjusting to their pace. When a super empath exhibits authentic confidence, it silently undermines these mechanisms. The avoidant is confronted with someone who no longer needs to be chased, reassured, or convinced. Their usual strategies of emotional leverage lose effectiveness, and this loss feels destabilizing to an ego accustomed to manipulate distance for comfort and control. What makes authentic confidence so powerful is its invisibility as a weapon. The empath is not trying to dominate, punish, or prove anything. They are simply aligned with their inner truth. They know what they deserve, and they navigate the relationship accordingly. They do not compromise their values or overextend themselves for approval. This alignment exposes the avoidant's inconsistencies without confrontation. They are left to face the reality that their ego had been reinforced by someone who was previously accommodating, but now stands firm in their self-respect. Avoidants may respond to this confidence with subtle resistance, coldness, passive-aggressive behavior, or withdrawal. These reactions are not signs of superiority. They are signs of discomfort. The avoidant ego is threatened by someone who is emotionally sovereign because it mirrors a reality they have long avoided acknowledging. True security does not come from distance, manipulation, or withholding. It comes from presence, integrity, and self-trust. The empath, by embodying these qualities, becomes a living mirror of what the avoidant has not cultivated. Confidence also changes the emotional rhythm of interactions. The super empath no longer reacts impulsively to every slight or distance. They do not bend themselves to soothe insecurities that are not theirs to fix. They respond with measured clarity, and when necessary, they step back without regret. To the avoidant, this unpredictability is unsettling. It disrupts patterns they have relied upon, forcing them to confront the fact that emotional dynamics are no longer one-sided. Furthermore, authentic confidence carries implicit challenge. It asks others to rise to meet it, not by force, but by presence. The avoidant is invited, silently and consistently, to engage in emotional maturity, accountability, and reciprocity. If they cannot, it becomes clear that the empath's life does not revolve around their emotional limitation. This is profoundly destabilizing for an ego built on the illusion of control, because it demonstrates that connection can exist on the empath's terms rather than being dictated by avoidance. For the empath, confidence is a byproduct of growth, self-reflection, and inner alignment. They do not need to convince anyone of their worth, yet their worth is palpable. It draws respect without demanding it, sets standards without enforcing them, and holds space without crowding. The avoidant may feel threatened, not because the empath intends harm, but because their own ego recognizes it cannot operate in the same space without exposure. Ultimately, authentic confidence is transformative because it reframes the entire dynamic. It replaces fear, uncertainty, and manipulation with clarity, stability, and self-possession. The avoidant is forced to acknowledge that the empath's value is not dependent on their approval or engagement, and that realization, quiet, subtle, yet undeniable, can shake an ego that once relied on emotional distance as a shield, leaving it exposed to truths it had long avoided. The peace of a super empath is one of the most disarming forces in any relationship, particularly when paired with an avoidant personality. This peace is not superficial or performative. It is deeply rooted in self-awareness, emotional maturity, and an understanding of one's intrinsic worth. It is the result of inner work, reflection, and alignment with personal values. rather than external circumstances. When an avoidant encounters this kind of unwavering peace, it challenges the very foundation upon which their ego has been built, and it does so without confrontation, drama, or force. Avoidants often rely on a subtle form of emotional leverage to maintain a sense of control. They use distance, unpredictability, and withholding as tools to manage the energy and attention of others. Their ego finds comfort in the tension they create, believing that it secures influence over the relationship. However, a super empath operating from peace is unaffected by these tactics. The calm presence of the empath is not reactive to manipulation or withdrawal. Instead, it radiates stability, showing that emotional equilibrium does not require the avoidant's validation or engagement. This peace is experienced by the avoidant not as apathy, but as a mirror. It reflects back a truth they often refuse to see. The connection is not dependent on them controlling the dynamic. The empath's serenity exposes the limitations of avoidance by highlighting what true emotional maturity looks like. Whereas the avoidant may have measured their significance through the responses they could elicit, the empath now exists in a state of alignment where significance is inherent, not negotiated. This reflection can be profoundly unsettling because it bypasses ego defenses and confronts them with their own unaddressed vulnerabilities. What makes this piece particularly disarming is its subtlety. It does not argue or demand. It's simply the empath's calmness is consistent and grounded, which disrupts the habitual push-pull dynamic that avoidants rely on. When emotional volatility and unpredictability no longer provoke a response, the avoidants' tools of control lose their potency. Their usual strategies, withdrawal, indifference, or passive testing, fail to elicit the intended reaction, leaving the ego in unfamiliar territory. For someone who has learned to manage relationships through distance, this can feel destabilizing and even threatening. The avoidant may attempt to rationalize or reinterpret the empath's peace as dissent, arrest, arrogance, or detachment, but deep down, they sense its truth. Peace is an unspoken assertion of sovereignty. It signals that the empath emotional well-being is no longer contingent on external factors. It communicates that they are whole in themselves, regardless of the other person's behavior. This revelation is quietly transformative because it reframes the relationship. The avoidant can no longer function under the illusion that they hold the primary power in determining emotional outcomes. Moreover, peace carries a silent accountability. It does not punish. It simply sets a standard. The avoidant is confronted with the realization that connection requires mutual respect, engagement, and integrity. They may feel tension, defensiveness, or discomfort because peace does not negotiate with inconsistency. It does not beg for reassurance or compromise boundaries for the sake of appeasement. By existing firmly in their center, the empath challenges the avoidant to either step into emotional responsibility or acknowledge their inability to meet it. For the empath, this peace is liberating, not controlling. It allows them to engage from a place of clarity rather than need to give, without sacrificing themselves, and to love without attachment to outcomes. And it is precisely this lack of dependence that unsettles the avoidant ego. When the avoidant encounters someone whose stability is independent of their actions, it exposes a fundamental truth: they were never truly in control. Ultimately, the super empath's peace becomes a quiet, undeniable force. It is not aggressive or loud, but it carries a power that cannot be contested. The avoidant, who once measured their significance through manipulation and emotional distance, now finds themselves confronted with the reality of a person who is whole, self-respecting, and unconquerable by tactics of avoidance. This realization, silent, profound, and inescapable, forces a reckoning that no argument or confrontation ever could, revealing that control was never theirs to begin with. Thank you for trusting me with your thoughts and time. Your presence truly matters. Wishing you clarity, strength, and peace. Until we meet again, goodbye for now.